In both my EOS R5 Mark II and R5C series, I've looked at the HDMI output, some of the metering tools like false color and Zebras. And in this video, I want to bring those two things together and look at using Zebras with basically those cameras, or really any camera that can support an HDMI output, on an external monitor. Now, specifically in this video, I'm going to be looking at Atomos monitors running Atomos OS 11, and specifically the Atomos Ninja Ultra. Although any Atomos monitors, the current line of Ninjas, Shoguns, Shinobis, etc., should all work basically the same as long as they're running the same version of Atomos OS. Now, before I get into the monitors itself, or the monitor itself, I want to reiterate that with any HDMI monitor's assistance functions, so whether it's Atomos branded or anybody else's, the capabilities of those functions are only as good as, or as accurate as, your camera's output setup and the monitor's input configuration is. This is important as there is no standard metadata for any of the manufacturer-specific log curves that you're probably going to be using, so Canon log, Sony log, Nikon log, etc. So while many monitors, at least this is the case for the Atomos ones, can automatically configure themselves for Rec 709, hybrid log gamma, or perceptual quantization sources, that's not going to be the case for a camera running in log. Now, on Atomos products, you manually do this configuration at the bottom of the input page of your monitor's setup menu. Now, since I'm working with an R5C set to log 3 output and in the cinema gamut, that's what I'm going to configure my Ninja Ultra in this case to use. But again, even if you're not using a monitor, you're just using, or a recorder, you're just using a monitor, you're going to do the same thing. Now, in theory, having this set up should be all I need to do to configure my Ninja Ultra here to properly deal with what my camera is sending to it. With the setup out of the way, let's dig into the Zebras themselves. To enable the Zebra Stripe overlay, touch the Zebra icon on the monitoring features touch bar. Now, Atomos monitors only have a single zebra pattern, and this pattern can be used as either an exposure guide or a clipping warning, though obviously since there's only one, you can't do both simultaneously. Now, if you're a Canon shooter like I am, then the Atomos Zebra is akin to using Canon's Zebra 1 pattern. That is, these zebras cover a 10% aperture or range, that's 5% above and 5% below your selected threshold, and the threshold can be adjusted in 5% increments. However, Atomos' allowable threshold range only covers from 50 to 105%, giving you a total range that you can cover in your zebras of 45 to 110%, again, depending on your settings. So that takes care of the simple part. Now we get to where things get complicated. Like most systems, Atomos uses a percentage-based scale. Now, if like me, you're used to Canon's system, you may already be questioning the whole 105% setting. After all, how do you get 105% on a 100% scale? Well, unlike Canon's Zebras, which use the underlying full-range digital values, Atomos uses the broadcast legal range instead. If you happen to be a Sony user, this is how your cameras will work. This means that where Canon's 100% for a 10-bit file corresponds to a value of 1023, Atomos' 100% for that same 10-bit file corresponds to a value of 940. Likewise, 0% on a Canon camera would correspond to 0, while 0% on an Atomos device corresponds to a value of 64, or at least it would if you could set the zebras that low. Now, the catch, of course, is that there's no simple conversion between the two ranges. At around 50% threshold, both are close. The error is about 1%, or a little bit less than 1% in that range. However, the error increases as you move towards the extremes. 100% in full range is 109% in legal range, and 90% in full range is 97% in legal range. Now, is that a problem? Well, the shorter answer is that depends on how you're using the zebras and how accurate you need them to be, and of course, how used to which scale you are. However, this isn't the only quirk to Atomos' zebras. In addition to using the broadcast scale, Atomos' zebras also use the monitor's display mode to set their levels. Now, the display mode is set up by bringing up the monitor feature setting menu page and then going to the monitor tab or page and selecting either native Rec 709, HLG, PQ, or LUT. Now, to me, coming from Canon cameras, this isn't very intuitive. It's also not necessarily a bad thing, at least as long as you're aware that it's happening. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the modes and how they affect things. And I'm going to start with the native mode. Native passes the input signal straight through the monitor without conversion. This is, of course, the kind of situation where you would want to use something like zebras as an exposure tool, at least where I would. However, in native mode, the zebras also get their luminance information from the input signal's levels. It doesn't get processed. Now, this approach is perfectly reasonable, except for the limited threshold range that Atomos provides. If you're using zebras as an exposure guide for skin tones, then you want your zebras to be set at around 36% reflectance, or about one stop above 18%, at least if you're dealing with people with light skin. So, for example, on a Canon camera, you would set your zebra threshold to either 40 or 45 plus or minus 5% to properly capture the 43% signal level that Canon Log 3 encodes that 36% reflectance at. And as an aside, at this level, the legal versus full range errors don't matter at all. It's close enough. However, neither of those thresholds are available in the Atomos Zebra range. And in fact, the 43% encoded value is lower than anything you can get. Incidentally, if you're a Sony Log 2 shooter, you're in the same boat. Your camera's zebras use the same scale as Atomos, but still need to be in the 40 to 45% range to properly capture the 36% scene reflectance of your subject in that log encoding. Now, I would note that this is not a problem with all log formats. They all encode things a little bit differently. ARRI Log C3, Canon Log 2, Nikon Log, and Sony Log 3 can all work at the 50% setting, though many of them will only work there because that minus 5% in the aperture just touches where 36% scene reflectance sits in their data curve. So, this is potentially problematic, but it can be workable in some situations if you know what you're doing. Now, the other case is, of course, using zebras as a clipping warning. Now, this also works, but you can be caught out by disappearing zebras if your levels aren't set up correctly. The legal versus full range situation comes into play here also. So again, for example, on a Canon camera, if you're shooting in Log 3, you might set Canon's Zebra 2 pattern to warn you at 90%. So anything that's 90% level or above will get zebraed. And that will give you about one stop or so of warning before clipping. Now, if you do the same on a Ninja or other Atomos recorder, the zebras will actually disappear when you're about a half stop away from clipping instead because you're outside of the aperture. Anything basically outside of that 10% aperture obviously doesn't get highlighted, which means if your actual levels, or you set your threshold, I should say, too low for a clipping warning, it won't actually warn you about the areas that are actually clipping. It'll warn you about areas that are below that. Now, of course, the solution to this particular problem is to use a threshold of 100 or 105%, which will always, at least in the case of 100%, almost always, cover everything up to the clipping point. So this does also cut down on the margin that your clipping warning provides. Now, again, neither of these are insurmountable or unmanageable problems. You just need to be aware of them and use the function correctly for your situation. So with that in mind, let me summarize quickly using Zebras and the native monitor profile with your various log systems. Now, if you're using Canon Log 3 or Sony Log 2, you want to use your Zebras as an exposure aid for skin tones, you technically can't. Those formats put the 36% scene level below the minimum aperture that you can set your Atomos Zebras to. For Canon Log 3 and Sony Log 2, the bottom of the Zebra's aperture is about 1/3 of a stop overexposed, and the top of the aperture is more than 1 1/3 stops overexposed if you happen to try to go that route. Now, if you want to use the Zebras for clipping, in both cases you'll want to set the camera's threshold to 100 or 105%. For both Canon Log 3 and Sony Log 2, using 100% will give you a clipping warning of about 1.12 stops below the actual clipping point, and at 105% the headroom is reduced to just under 3/4 of a stop. Setting the threshold lower than 100% will result in incomplete coverage of the clipping region, and given the fact that everything looks basically white at that point, it's really hard to tell that you're not actually clipping. Now, for Canon Log 2, Fuji Log 2, and Sony Log 3, using the Zebras as a skin tone exposure aid works. Well, at least the skin tones aren't inherently outside of the Zebra's aperture at the 50% threshold setting, but they're very much on the very bottom end of that. That said, the Zebras are still heavily skewed towards overexposing in that situation, but that's not a bad problem if it's close enough. Now, as a clipping warning, the same recommendations apply here. Use 100 or 105%. At 100%, Canon Log 2 will have 1.7 stops of highlight headroom, and Sony Log 3 will have about 1.1 stops. Okay, so that takes care of native. Let's talk about option 2, Rec 709. Selecting this converts the configured gamma and color space that your camera is sending into Rec 709 for display and what will be used by the Zebras. Now, since the Zebras take their levels from the monitor's display level, this radically changes how the Zebras work, since they're now literally only looking at the Rec 709 part of the data. Now, the good news here is this. If you learn to use Zebras in a broadcast context, or from somebody who is a more older photographer, cinematographer, or worked in that context, you're pretty much good to go here. If you set your Zebra threshold to 60% or thereabouts, like you would have in a Rec 709 broadcast environment, you end up with Zebras spot on the skin tones, just as you would have in the past. Now, the problem with the Zebras in Rec 709 mode is when you use them as a clipping warning. Because log curves are HDR formats, they have way more dynamic range above the 36% level than Rec 709 does. In most cases, we're talking about something on the order of 5 or 6 stops more range. So if you set your Zebra threshold to its max, 105%, you're actually going to end up with something like 4 or 5 stops of headroom before you actually start clipping your data, even though the Zebras are telling you that you are clipping. In fact, what you see if you do this is something like this. If you go by what the Ninja Zebras are saying here, the image is clipping and you can't do anything about it because clipping is lost information. But if you look at my camera's false color display, it's nowhere near clipping. We're in that sweet spot, or that spot of log data that's perfectly usable. The short of this is simple. If you're delivering in Rec 709, regardless of whether you choose to shoot in log or not, then set your monitor to the Rec 709 mode and use the Zebras as an exposure aid. Set them to 60%, just as you would if you were working in a Rec 709 setup only, and it'll work just fine. However, if you attempt to use the Zebras here as a clipping warning, then they will warn you that you are clipping the Rec 709 content, but they will be way off compared to the log files that you're actually recording, assuming you're working that way. Now, of course, as long as you don't use up that massive amount of log headroom that you have, you can always bring that exposure back in post and things will look fine. So that brings me to the third option, hybrid log gamma, or HLG. Hybrid log gamma is one of the two HDR curves that are defined by the BT2100 standard. And at least with Canon's log 3, this works really well on my Ninja as a display mode with Zebras. For clipping, you can use the 100% threshold setting and get a clipping curve or a zebra response that's very close to what Canon's false color clipping warnings will show you, giving you about a half or just over stop of margin. Unfortunately for skin tones, you still have the same problem as the native modes with log gammas. You just can't get the zebras set low enough to cover the skin tone region properly when you are in HLG. So the short of it is that hybrid log gamma, at least when shooting with Canon log 3, gives you a decent looking monitor preview. It's got good contrast and the backlight kicks up with brightness to cover the HDR range. But it also works with Zebras set up to be a clipping warning, and the margin isn't overly generous to the point that you might stop really paying attention because you know you have a ton of extra space. Now that brings me to the last two monitor modes that Atomos has on their monitors, PQ and LUT. PQ, of course, is the other high dynamic range curve that's part of BT2100, and LUT is the mode on the Atomos Ninjas or Atomos recorders and monitors where you apply your own LUT and it does the color transform based on that. Now, in my testing with PQ mode and at least Canon log 3, the correct threshold for clipping is 85%. Any higher than that and you don't get an accurate reflection of your camera's clipping point. However, with the 50% minimum threshold, using it as an exposure indicator for skin tones is basically impossible in this situation, or at least you'll get a massively overexposed image. Altogether, I find that when I'm working in log, or at least Canon log 3, I prefer to use hybrid log gamma if I'm going to do it that way than PQ mode, just because things make a little bit more sense to me. Now, the other option is, of course, using the LUT monitor mode. And as I said, this is where you apply a custom LUT that converts your input into the output. Yes, Zebras work in that mode, and they're taken from the LUT's converted exposure data, not the HDMI signal levels. At least that's what my testing confirms. However, the thresholds that you need to use, either as a white clipping warning or an exposure warning, are going to be dependent on the LUT you're using. Consequently, I can't provide any kind of general guidance on this because there is none. So let me wrap this up by summarizing the key points here. First, Atomos' Zebras are set up by setting the center level, or they call it threshold, of a 10% wide aperture. That is, they cover 5% above and below that set threshold level. That said, since there's no way to set the Zebras to a minimum threshold, that is, that they cover everything above that level and nothing else, they can be problematic as a clipping warning in some situations. Second, the Zebras can be set from 50 to 105% in 5% increments. Third, Atomos' Zebras use a percentage of the legal range of video data, not the full range. This is why the threshold goes above 100%, and the good news on that, of course, is that at 50%, the difference between legal and full isn't significant, but that does approach 10%, specifically 9%, at the high end of the range. And if you could go to the low end of the range, you would also have the same problem. Finally, Atomos' Zebra levels are taken from the post-conversion image. This means that they change depending on whether you have the monitor set to native, Rec 709, hybrid log gamma, perceptual quantization, or LUT. Now, because of this, what you can use the Zebras for, that is, as an exposure aid or a clipping warning, their capabilities and their accuracy depend on the monitor mode you've selected and how that interacts with the log curve that you're actually shooting in. Now, that said, while this may be different from what you're used to on your camera, especially if you're perhaps a Canon shooter, the approach can be very effective as long as you understand the constraints. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.